Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. We have opened the webinar presentation Zoom to the folks in the waiting room. We're going to give people a few minutes to log in this morning, and then we'll get started. So sit tight, and again, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, good morning, everybody. This is Kristen Appold with the Division of Drinking Water. We're just giving folks another minute or two to log in this morning. It is an early start, and just give us one more minute, and then we'll get started. So again, thanks for joining us today. All right, let's get started today, and I'll share my video. Let's see who's talking. All right, well, today we are presenting on the 2022 Drinking Water Needs Assessment results. And again, we're super excited to have you with us today. We are going to cover some meeting logistics before we get started. But again, let me just quickly introduce myself. My name is Kristen Appold. I am the senior or supervisor for the Needs Analysis Unit within the Division of Drinking Water. And we have a number of other panelists today who are going to be presenting on pieces of work that they've done for us. So we're really excited today to present all of the amazing work that's happened over the last year. Before we get started, I wanted to draw your attention to the interpretation options below. I encourage everyone to click on the global icon that says interpretation and choose your preference for the language for today. We have English and Spanish, and I'm going to invite Aldo on to translate that for us.
Thank you so much, Christian. Thank you. Muy buenos días a todos. Esta reunión se llevará a cabo en inglés y en español, pero la interpretación se va a proporcionar. Así que si son tan amables de ir a la parte inferior de su pantalla, verán un icono en forma de un mundo. Favor de presionar el mundo para que puedan escuchar la interpretación en vivo. Si tienen algún problema técnico, favor de escribirlo en el chat o comunicarse con nosotros y lo apoyaremos con mucho gusto. Que tengan una buena reunión. Thank you, Kristen. You may continue.
Thank you, Aldo. And again, I encourage everyone to choose the appropriate channel so that they see the correct slide deck. and the right language. Some other logistics for how to participate in today's webinar. Again, this is really meant to be a discussion between us and you. We do have a number of folks who are logged in through our Zoom platform, which gives you a bit more flexibility in terms of participating today. You can raise your hand during the Q&A sessions. You can also use the Q&A or question and answer chat box to submit questions to us. We are going to be pausing after certain pieces of the agenda today to allow for Q&A, and then we'll hopefully have a good chunk of time at the end of the webinar for an open discussion. Again, I really want to encourage you, folks who are participating via Zoom, to either raise your hand or use that Q&A box. For those who are using the video live cast on the Cal EPA website, to participate, we encourage you to email us at safer@waterboards.ca.gov. You can email us questions there. We do have staff who are monitoring that inbox, and we'll share your questions with the panelists during the Q&A sessions. So again, you can email us at safer@waterboards.ca.gov. If for any reason we're not able to answer your question on today's webinar, or we don't have enough time to address it, we will get back to you via email after the webinar has concluded. I am getting a notification that there's no Spanish audio on the Spanish live cast. Hopefully that will be fixed soon. Oh, it looks like they've got it now. Great, so we're gonna keep moving forward. Before I begin, I just wanted to remind everyone the Water Board's mission. Our mission here at the State Water Board is to preserve, enhance, and restore the quality of California's water resources and drinking water for the protection of the environment, public health, and all beneficial uses, and to ensure proper water resource allocation and efficient use for the benefit of the present and future generations. For today, we're going to cover a handful of topics, and I want you all to buckle in because we have a lot of material to cover. First, I'm going to give an overview of the SAFER program and the needs assessment. We're then going to walk through the results of all three components of the needs assessment. We're going to talk about our risk assessment for public water systems, state small water systems, and domestic wells. We're going to discuss our drought infrastructure cost assessment results, and then our affordability assessment results. And we'll conclude today's webinar with a next step. There is a break in the middle of this presentation, so you will have a bio break if you need it. But let's jump in. I'm going to provide an overview of the SAFER program and the needs assessment. Before we begin, I'd like to get a better sense of our audience today. I'm going to launch our first poll question. And we want to know, have you heard about the drinking water needs assessment before? It'd be great to know how much background information you guys might be interested in. We'll give you all just a few more seconds to answer the poll question. All right, 5 more seconds. Okay, and poll. And I'm sharing the results. It looks like the majority of you, 82%, are already familiar with the drinking water needs assessment. That's fantastic to hear. This is only our second year conducting the needs assessment, so it's great that a lot of you have already heard about it. But we do have a handful of folks who have never heard about the needs assessment before, so I'm really excited to share information about this, this work. And if you have questions, please engage with us. Okay. So, I'm going to provide a little bit of background information about the SAFER program and the needs assessment to help set the stage for today's webinar. We always like to start by talking about the human right to water, and we are celebrating the 10-year anniversary of the human right to water. Back in 2012, the state of California adopted the human right to water which is every human being has the right to safe, clean, affordable, accessible water adequate for human consumption, cooking, and sanitary purposes. Fast forward a few years later, in 2019, Senate Bill 200 was passed, which really gave the State Water Board the tools and resources to help advance the goals of the human right to water. It created the Safe and Affordable Funding for Equity and Resilience program. We call it the SAFER program. And again, this program has a lot of diverse tools and resources that the State Water Board is able to use to really help advance long-term solutions for communities across the state. Today, you'll hear me reference a few times the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund. This was the really important piece of funding that was needed to help us advance these goals. It's a unique funding source that was created out of SB 200, and it helps drive a lot of the work and the reason why we have our needs assessment. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But the SAFER program also has other tools at its disposal. We have consolidation and administrator authorities. We can advance technical assistance to help with capacity building. We have staff throughout the state who are helping communities identify and better understand their challenges and seek long-term solutions. The Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund, that new pot of money that was created out of SB 200, is about $130 million a year till 2030. And what's really important is that in the legislation, the fund expenditure plan is supposed to be informed by something called the needs assessment. And that's why we're here today, is to talk about the needs assessment, which is supposed to inform how we prioritize our funding and our outreach work for the SAFER program. The needs assessment has three core components. It has a risk assessment, a cost assessment, and an affordability assessment. The analysis that's conducted in the needs assessment really is supposed to help identify how we prioritize which water systems and communities we're targeting for financial and technical assistance, as well as where our staff, again, are engaging. It's really, we know that there's a lot of water systems and a lot of communities out there that may need help, and we only have so many resources at our disposal. So having a fair and equitable way of identifying water systems that are our highest priority is something that the SAFER program has been striving to do. You can see here, I call this our priority pyramid, but we have failing water systems at the top. Those are community water systems in K through 12 public schools that are meeting our failing criteria. And I'll discuss that a little bit later. Second priority is our at-risk water systems and domestic wells, and then potentially at risk and then not at risk. Again, this priority setting is really important for us to help direct our efforts here at the State Water Board. Last year, we conducted the first full drinking water needs assessment. We do have a website where you can access that report, and I encourage you to take a look at it. We also have a lot of materials on there documenting the development of our methodologies used in the needs assessment, so you can track how things are evolving over time. And we're very excited that we were able to finally release the 2022 needs assessment. We shared those materials with registrants and folks yesterday. So I would be surprised if many people have read the report, but if you have, kudos to you. We do encourage you all to take a look. The full report is posted. We've also broken it out into its different sections if you're only interested in certain components, but that is on our website. But before I start talking about the results, I think it's important that we do a little retrospective, looking back at what the SAFER program has accomplished since 2021. So the SAFER program has been really busy helping communities implement short-term and long-term solutions. You can see on the screen here that we have benefited over 350,000 individuals, helping to secure, again, both long-term and short-term solutions. And this really takes and this is around our funding programs and some of our technical assistance. Some new activities in 2021 that we initiated as well. We have a new strategy for helping state small water systems and domestic wells. And for those of you who are not familiar with the terminology, state small water systems are very small water systems with 15 connections or less that are regulated by counties, not the state water board, but they are important to the SAFER program. This new strategy involves a centralized domestic well and state small water system data collection effort. We have funding for counties to help develop programs to address local needs. We're starting to implement a regionalization pilot project, and we're also starting to implement a point of use, point of entry pilot project as well. I encourage you to learn more about our work on our website. I also encourage you to take a look at the report, the 2022 report. We do have a chapter in that report that is a retrospective looking at the accomplishments of the SAFER program in 2021. Well, moving forward, I think it's really important that we start at the top of our priority pyramid and talk about our failing water systems, what we sometimes refer to as our human right to water list. These are systems that are failing to meet the goals of the human right to water. Again, we are looking at community water systems and K through 12 schools. The failing criteria that we have does not apply currently to domestic wells or state small water systems. We do maintain an ongoing list of our failing water systems. We have a new database that is able to capture the systems that are coming on and off the list on a daily basis now, and I'm excited to share in a little bit. We have been able to push this data to our website so that everyone can access the current list of failing systems in real time. The criteria for failing is something that's evolved over time. Last year, we expanded the criteria for failing to include E. coli violations, treatment technique violations, and monitoring and reporting violations. I think this is something that is important to keep in mind as we look at the failing list, since we have criteria that has changed with time. And we anticipate that this could expand in the future as well. So if you're interested in learning more about the failing criteria, we do have thorough documentation on our website explaining how systems can meet this criteria and how they can get off of our list. When we do a retrospective looking back at 2021, there were 416 unique water systems that were on the failing human right to water list. Now, it doesn't mean that all 416 failed in 2021. We have a good chunk of those systems were already on the list at the beginning of the year and then remained on the list throughout the year and did not come off. You can see here we're starting to track which of the failing human right to water criteria water systems are meeting. And you can see the vast majority for both small and medium-sized systems is still primary MCL violations. Monitoring reporting violations is the second highest category, followed by secondary MCL and treatment technique violations. For our primary and secondary MCL violations, we did an analysis this year looking at the leading contaminants that were having water systems on our list. For primary MCL violations, we have arsenic, 1,2,3, TCP, and nitrates leading systems to be in violation. For secondary MCL violations, manganese and iron are highest count of violations for these systems. Unique to this year, we're excited to include some additional analysis in our report around socioeconomic characteristics of the water systems and areas analyzed in our report. We did a quick look at our failing human right to water list systems in 2021 and saw that the majority of those systems were serving mostly non-white communities, and you can see the breakdown here. We have some additional analysis in the report that also looks at pollution burden and poverty prevalence in these areas as well. I do want to note that while we do have a lot of water systems on our failing water list, approximately 90% of those systems are progressing towards long-term solutions. We do have funding programs. We have staff that are reaching out consistently to our failing systems to try to identify those solutions. If you are on that failing list or you know a community that is, please reach out to us. We have financial assistance and technical assistance that we'd love to use. But this is our challenge. This is why the SAFER program exists, and this is why we have the needs assessment. We have around 70 unique water systems that are coming onto our failing list each year. And to be proactive, we needed to develop a methodology for identifying water systems that may fail and try to bring solutions to that community before failure happens. So to do that, we needed to develop a risk assessment. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. We do break up our risk assessment methodology for public water systems. And then we have a separate risk assessment method for our state smalls and domestic wells. And Emily is going to come on and talk about that after I'm finished with public water systems. So for those of you who are familiar with what analysis was done in the 2021 assessment, we did make a number of changes this year to enhance our risk assessment for public water systems. One of those key enhancements was the expansion of the inventory or list of water systems that were included in the assessment this year. Last year, we only looked at very small water systems that had 33 connections or less and K through 12 schools. This year, we expanded our inventory of systems to include community water systems with up to 30,000 service connections and 100,000 populations served. K through 12 schools are still included, and we still excluded wholesalers. The driver for expanding our inventory was to align with our expanded grant eligibilities that we have for medium-sized systems. We wanted to make sure that those medium-sized systems were included in our priority setting. I'm going to provide a brief overview of our risk assessment methodology. You're going to hear me reference a number of different kind of wonky terms, so bear with me. Our risk assessment is reliant upon things that we call risk indicators. These are quantifiable metrics that are data points used from across a number of different sources to help us identify systems that are at risk. In order to identify systems at risk using these metrics, we had to create thresholds. So a system has to perform at a certain in a certain way in order to meet a risk threshold. And then we apply weights and scores to help us come out with a final risk assessment result. So I'm going to provide some examples and talk through how we do that. But first, I'm going to start with our risk indicators. In 2021, we had 19 risk indicators in our assessment that fall underneath the 4 categories of water quality, accessibility, affordability, and technical, managerial, financial capacity. We made a number of changes to our risk indicators this year, mostly in response to feedback that we got after we released the 2021 report. We wanted to be responsive to all the great suggestions that our stakeholders were submitting to us. I'm going to just provide a high-level overview of the new indicators and the ones that we removed. I encourage you to take a look at our report. It has detailed information about each of these indicators, the definitions, how we calculate them, etc. So in our water quality category, we removed the risk indicator of maximum duration of HPE. This was a fairly complicated risk indicator that looked at exposure over time to certain contaminants. It was a tricky indicator to calculate and for folks to understand. We really want accessibility in our method to shine through. So we did respond to feedback and removed it from our water quality category, but we did add a new indicator called Constituents of Emerging Concern. This is looking at currently contaminants that do not have an MCL, but we are only looking at 3 contaminants here, PFOA, PFOS, 1,4-dioxane, and hexavalent chromium. In the accessibility category, we removed water source types because there was a lot of redundancy there with number of sources. But we did add 2 new risk indicators in this category, and we're very excited about these. This was in direct response to feedback last year that our accessibility category did not fully capture water systems that were experiencing source capacity challenges. So we have 2 new indicators. The first is bottled or hauled water reliance. If we have a water system that has been relying on bottled or hauled water to meet their demand because their sources are unable to meet demand, they are assigned risk points. And then we also have some newly created source capacity violations that the Water Board has started using this past year. Those are fairly new to the Water Board, so we don't see a lot of water systems getting risk points in this category yet, but we now have the capability of identifying systems that are not meeting water work standards, so they're captured in that new indicator. In the affordability category, because of the shutoff moratorium during the COVID pandemic, we had to remove percent shutoffs from our analysis. There was no data for that indicator. We did use data collected during our survey last year and with a new program that we initiated this past year for arrearage or debt relief. We looked at outstanding debt that accrued during the pandemic, percent of residential arrearages, so the number of residential accounts or percent of residential accounts that were in debt during the COVID pandemic. And then we looked at residential arrearage burden, which is if you were to spread out that residential debt across your entire rate base, what would that burden be to your rate base? I do want to caveat that this is data collected during a difficult time in our state during the COVID pandemic and may not reflect debt trends over time. We will most likely be tracking this as we move forward, and you would see affordability performance change over time as the state recovers from the pandemic. In the TMF, or Technical Managerial Financial Capacity category, we removed number of service connections as an indicator. That, in essence, was a proxy that we used last year to help us identify water systems that may not have a large enough rate base to shoulder future costs for that system. We were able to start collecting new financial data in our electronic annual report. And so we've included new financial indicators in this category, so we thought appropriate to remove number of service connections. We removed extensive treatment installed because that indicator would have been a biased indicator towards our medium-sized systems. So we did remove that one from the assessment this year, but we did add those 3 new financial indicators. We're looking at net positive income, operating ratio, is the water system bringing in enough revenue to cover their annual O&M costs, and then days cash on hand. Does the water system have enough financial reserves in case of emergency where they would need to make perhaps some unplanned capital improvements? It's important to have days cash on hand, just like it is for all of us to have savings in the bank just in case of an emergency. Again, you can learn more about those risk indicators in our report. I wanted to give a quick example of how we use these risk indicators in our overall risk assessment. We typically have thresholds for how a water system may be performing for that individual risk indicator. The example here on the screen is past presence on the failing water system. On the failing human water list. Our thresholds, we have 3 of them. We always have a 0 threshold, which is no risk. So here, if a water system had no occurrences on the list within the last 3 years, they get 0 risk points. There's no risk associated with that system for this indicator. We have a second threshold. Threshold 1 is 1 occurrence over the last 3 years, and you can see a raw score of 0.5. And then a threshold 2 is the highest risk, which is 2 or more occurrences on the last 3 years, and a raw score of 1. So our raw scores range from 0 to 1. This is how we normalize performance across different metrics in the assessment. Each risk indicator has a weight that's been applied to it. This is based on public feedback that we received in 2020 when we were developing our initial methodologies. The weights help us kind of pump up the risk level of certain indicators that our stakeholders and our staff believe were more critical to risk than others. So you can see here we have a weight of 2 for this indicator, and our weights go from 1 to 3. We multiply the raw score and the weight to get the max risk score for that indicator, and you can see the risk levels that are associated with those. When we were developing our initial methodologies, we also got feedback that folks felt like our categories themselves should also have different weights associated with them. So we do have an additional multiplier. Water quality has the highest weight of 3. Accessibility and technical, managerial, financial capacity have a weight of 2, and affordability a weight of 1. For those of you who are wonky and want to understand the math, it's not too complicated, but we essentially add up the weighted risk indicator scores within each category, and then divide by the number of indicators in the categories themselves. Once we get that score, we then multiply them by their category weight, add them all up, divide by 4 again, and we get that aggregated risk assessment score. Now, the reason why we divide by the number of indicators at that top level and then the number of categories in that middle level is to help us adjust for if we're missing data. If we're missing data for water systems, we need to readjust the weights within each of those categories. So this helps us, again, normalize things, and so we can compare water systems who might not have data for some indicators to those who do. When we add everything up, we get a final risk score. This is the distribution of risk scores, and the red indicates those systems that were on our failing list in 2021, and the blue are those that were not on our failing list. And we use our current failing list or the failing list in the past to help us gauge where our risk thresholds should be. You can see here our at-risk threshold is at 0.8, and then our potentially at-risk threshold is between 0.6 and 0.8. We did adjust our total risk assessment thresholds this year to account for the changes in the total average statewide score, risk scores across all systems analyzed. And again, you can learn more about that in our paper, but I think you're all here to learn more about the results. So the risk assessment results are on the screen. What we do is we pull out those systems that were on the failing list at our snapshot in time. So when we did our analysis looking at January 1st, 2022, we had 346 failing systems. We have 508 at-risk systems, 453 potentially at risk, and the vast majority of the systems analyzed, nearly 1,800, are not at risk. We have a number of different ways we've sliced and diced the data in the report. I'm going to highlight a few. I think it's really important for us to mention that to get on our at-risk list, a water system really has to be performing poorly across a number of risk indicators. If a water system is only meeting the risk criteria for one indicator, that's not going to get them on the list. When we did an analysis, on average, our at-risk water systems were exceeding the risk thresholds for at least 7 risk indicators. So the graph here kind of depicts the number of thresholds that would need to be met to get on that list. When we look at the distribution of our at-risk water systems across the state, we see that Madera County and Kern County have some of the highest numbers, but we do have a breakdown in the report as well as in a new dashboard, which I'll demo in just a bit. I do want to highlight that the vast majority of customers served by water systems are served by not at-risk water systems. We see that a good chunk of our failing and at-risk water systems are small water systems. So we do break down again the results by population served and number of service connections. I do want to highlight that our risk assessment still excludes large water systems, which serve an even larger proportion of customers across the state. So just please keep that in mind when you're looking at the results of the analysis. Like I mentioned before, this is the first year that we've incorporated some additional analysis looking at how our results of our analysis, how they overlap with some socioeconomic metrics. So we took our list of systems and we calculated their pollution burden. We looked at poverty metrics, and we looked at demographic information as well. We have much larger tables with many different types of data in the report, but I just included a few pieces here in the PowerPoint presentation for today. I'm not going to go over all the numbers, but the trends that we see is that as systems become more at risk and all the way up to failing, we see upward trends in pollution burden, in poverty prevalence, and in larger proportions of non-white communities served. I am very excited to share with you all a new tool that we just released yesterday. One of the pieces of feedback that we received last year was that it was very difficult to navigate the results of the risk assessment. We have big spreadsheets. It's not very easy to figure out if a water system is at risk or not and why they're at risk. And so I'm going to share my screen and screen one. There we go. And share with you the new dashboard. So bear with me as I bring that up. Oops, not that one. This one. Okay. So how do you get to our dashboard? Well, I have the link in the PowerPoint presentation, but when you come to our Drinking Water Needs Assessment webpage, you will see an icon to explore our dashboard. And when you're on our dashboard, it looks something like this. We have, it's going to refresh a little bit. So we have at the top our failing, at risk, potentially at risk, not at risk, and then not assessed. Those are our large water systems at the top. I want to just point out that the numbers in this dashboard are going to be different than what's in the report, because we actually have, we've done somewhat of a data refresh. So we have newer data in the dashboard, and our failing list of human right to water list systems is updated on a daily basis now. This is the statewide view of the dashboard. We have filters all along the left-hand side. So if you're only interested in looking at the failing systems or at-risk systems, you can do that. You can also filter by service connections, population, county, regulating agency, the economic status of that water system. So if it's a DAC, a disadvantaged or severely disadvantaged community. We also have whether or not that system has received funding since 2017. You can see that the numbers up here are definitely, they change as you apply filters. And because I have so many different programs running right now, it's going to be fairly slow. So if you go to, I'm going to just pick some other tabs here. So here we're looking at just Monterey County. And as you filter, the numbers at the top are going to change. The drivers towards risk are going to change. And you'll see the number of systems that are meeting the failing criteria, or I'm sorry, the risk criteria per indicator are going to be here. At the bottom, if you click show the list, you'll see the full list of systems and how they're performing, and you can export that data. And then if I can click here, we also have, if you click on the risk categories, we have a breakdown per category. So if you're interested in looking at the systems, oops, it's going to refresh, apologies. If you're interested in looking at just the water systems that have, maybe a high risk level for accessibility, for example, you can do that. If you click on any of the titles of the risk indicators, it will open a tab with the definitions. And then I'll go back here. Another thing you can do is if you click on any of those point locations, you can search. There's a search bar here. You can search for a water system. But if you click on any of these dots, it will open an individual water system profile. And it looks like this is refreshing too. There we go. For this water system, the system is currently on our failing list. But if it was to come off the failing list, it would then be an at-risk water system because that is how it performed in our risk assessment. We have some data points at the top around population, service connections. We do have information around whether or not they've received any planning or construction funding or technical assistance funding since 2017. You can see how that system's performing again in the risk assessment. And down at the bottom here, we're displaying the failing criteria that the system is meeting. So this system's been on the human right to water list since 2018 for arsenic for a primary MCL violation. Again, if you click on any of these, you're going to get the definition and the criteria. You can also see how that system performed in the risk assessment. If you click here on risk categories, you'll see which thresholds they're meeting and whether or not that's high, medium, or no risk over here. Let's see. Yep. I think I have another one open. Maybe not. Okay. So hopefully that's a quick overview of the dashboard. We're probably going to host another webinar to give folks another kind of deeper dive in how to use the dashboard. And I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint presentation. Again, really excited to share that with you. But we also have all of the raw data, again, publicly posted on our website. So if you really want to dive in and understand why systems are at risk, what was the underlying data that led them to be on our list or not on the list, it's all in our spreadsheet. And if you notice that there is data that is inaccurate for a water system or a community, please reach out to us. We do have a data change request form. Our staff checks this every day, and we try to be as responsive as possible in responding to those requests. I'm going to take a breather and take a look at our Q&A box. If you have any questions about the risk assessment for public water systems, I encourage you to either raise your hand or submit a question. And for those of you who are participating with the Cal EPA live webcast, please email us at safer@waterboards.ca.gov. We have someone monitoring that inbox who can share your question with us. I'll give you all just a few moments. I think Janine says that she loves the dashboard. Awesome, thank you, we do too. From Kyle, we have this analysis is specific to small public water systems. Is there a consideration to include private water systems or mutual water companies in the future? If not, why? Kyle, public water systems, we are looking at just small or medium-sized water systems. If it is a small or medium-sized mutual or private water system, it is included in our analysis. We look at both public and private. There have been discussions around inclusion of larger water systems in the future, but that's something that we want to workshop with folks over the next year or so to figure out the best approach to do that. Our original risk assessment methodology was designed for smaller water systems. We did make a number of adjustments this year to accommodate medium-sized systems. We want to make sure we work with folks to figure out the best approach to include those much larger water systems in the analysis. So I hope that answers your question. There's a question around whether or not there's a timeline for when state small water systems will be included in the dashboard. Thank you, Ashley, for your question. We are hoping to do that sometime this year. I can't make any promises. We are very constrained on the IT side of things, but it's something that we're hopeful we can come up with very soon. So stay tuned, Ashley. And once we're able to do that, we'll definitely send out an email notification. But I appreciate your question. It's something that we're definitely looking forward to doing. We've got some more positive feedback on the tool, which is great. We really appreciate that. A lot of hard work went into that tool. Someone is asking, Eric is asking, why are some systems on the failing human right to water list and not on the at-risk system list? Is this a scoring flaw in the risk scoring method? So it's a great question, Eric. And We do have a number of water systems that come onto our failing list that were not captured in our risk assessment, either last year or this year. And that's why we're continuously trying to improve our risk assessment. We did do a predictive power analysis of our risk assessment, comparing to the list of systems that were on the failing list in 2021. And our risk assessment predicted 77% of those systems that ended up on the list. We think that's a pretty good number, but there are always going to be water systems that are going to fall through the cracks, either because perhaps the data that we have in our systems maybe doesn't reflect reality, or something's happened. It wasn't anticipated, and we're always trying to improve, though, but I appreciate that. Eric's also asking whether or not the State Water Board has a process for checking in with district engineers and local regulators to make sure the list is up to date. Eric, absolutely. So our failing list is based on violations and enforcement actions that are issued by our district engineers and our local regulators. So we're constantly relying on their data. Okay. I'm trying to see what else we've got in the Q&A box. We have, if you dig into the details of a particular system that exceeded an MCL, can one identify those that are over nitrate or other fertilizer components? Yes, you'll be able to identify systems that have MCL for nitrate and for other contaminants when you export that data. I do want to point out the dashboard is going to always be displaying the most recent current list of failing systems. If you're interested in the historical list of systems that were on the list in the past, but perhaps are no longer on, but you would like to know why they were on the list, please reach out to us. We can send you a data pool that has that information in it. Awesome. All right, I don't see any other questions, but I do see a hand. Terrence, I'm going to unmute you. There we go. Terrence, you should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hey, Kristen, sorry about that. Had some audio issues. Hopefully you can hear me now.
I can hear you, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to elaborate on that earlier question. Private water systems, since our, earlier conversations revolved around considerations for investor-owned utilities. So if you could just expand on the needs assessment incorporating the investor-owned utilities, I'd really appreciate that.
Thanks, Terrence. Yeah, larger water systems. So systems that have more than 30,000 service connections or serve a population greater than 100,000 are not included in our risk assessment. There's definitely interest to include those larger water systems in the future, but we would definitely need to work with our stakeholders, with staff and others like CPUC to develop potentially new indicators or maybe even an alternative approach to assessing risk for these larger systems. Does that answer your question, Terrence?
Yes, thank you so much. And just want to clarify that the small private investor-owned utilities are a part of this as well.
Yes,
less than 3,000 service connections.
Yeah. Thanks, Terrence. I just want to point out a few things because I'm seeing some chat on the side here. I've got two monitors. So if you see me looking to the right, that's what I'm looking at. I just want to point out that systems that have violations but no enforcement actions are not going to show up on our human right to water list for primary and secondary violations or E. coli violations. If you know of a system that's received a violation for a certain contaminant, but that system's not getting onto the human right to water list, the failing list, definitely please follow up and contact us. We can talk to the district engineer to see whether or not an enforcement action is going to be issued. But we have pretty stringent criteria that gets you on that failing list. So I think this is a bit of a follow-up to Eric's question. But again, if you see any data or information in our assessment that just doesn't look right, please contact us. We're happy to investigate it. There can definitely be data errors, and we want to make sure that we're responsive to them. All right, I don't see any other questions in the Q&A, and I don't see anything in chat, so nothing's coming through email and no other hands. I'm gonna be quiet for 15 seconds and see if anyone else has anything to add. Okay, awesome. Well, I am excited then to turn things over to Emily Houlihan. She is with our Division of Water Quality and spearheads the risk assessment for state small water systems and domestic wells. I am going to be advancing the slides for Emily. Emily, do you want to come on and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Emily Houlihan. I'm an engineering geologist in the Groundwater Ambient Monitoring and Assessment Unit in the Division of Water Quality. And today I'll be presenting the risk assessment results for state small water systems and domestic wells. Next slide, please. So just as a brief reminder, state small water systems are those with between 5 and 14 connections, and domestic wells are wells that have less than 5 connections. So that's the context here. So in 2021, the risk assessment for these systems was entirely based on their water quality risk. We used data from the State Water Board's Aquifer Risk Map to identify the number and location of at-risk and potentially at-risk state small water systems and domestic wells. Next slide, please. So for this year, for the 2022 risk assessment, we still use water quality risk as one indicator, but we also added a new drought risk component as a second indicator. So for this, we used a tool that's created by the Department of Water Resources, their water shortage risk vulnerability tool, and specifically their tool for self-supplied communities, which tracks with state small water systems and domestic wells. So this year we used the combination of these two indicators to determine the number and location of at-risk and potentially at-risk systems. Next slide, please. Thanks. So just a little bit more detail about the data sources. Again, the water quality data is coming from the Aquifer Risk Map. And because we do not have water quality results directly from a lot of domestic wells and state small water systems, this map estimates and models water quality risk based on data from nearby wells that we do have data from. And risk is assessed by comparing water quality results to the maximum contaminant level, if that's available. For water shortage data, again, we used the tool that was developed by the Department of Water Resources, and their tool calculates risk from a wide suite of factors. I've listed some of them here. I won't read them all out. But basically the risk, the drought risk of each area is determined by calculating risk based on those factors and then comparing it to all other areas of the state. So the final risk is a relative risk percentile. And finally, for our final data source, we used location data from 2 places. First, we took domestic well density data from the Department of Water Resources online system for well completion reports, and we took state small water system location from the Division of Drinking Water. So for the water quality results, so for the at-risk domestic wells and state small water systems, these are the primary contaminants that we see contributing to that risk. The top 2 contaminants that we see affecting domestic wells and state small water systems are primarily nitrate and arsenic. So again, this risk assessment is very different from that of public water systems because we're dealing with a much more limited data availability. So we really only have two indicators to assess the risk. That's water quality risk and drought risk. So to combine these two indicators, we first normalized their risk scores from the two data sets that I described. We added the normalized scores together and simply divided by 2. And that's how we get the final combined risk score for each area. The unit of analysis that we used is square mile section. So we used the Public Land Survey System square mile sections. And again, that's because we don't have data directly from these wells or systems most of the time. And so this is a risk assessment for an area, and then any wells or systems within that area are assumed to have that same risk. So this infographic shows the potential combined risk scores given different water quality risk and different drought risk. And the colors are going to track, when I show the web tool, the same colors will indicate the same risk. So actually, let's go to the next slide, please. So to determine the final risk ranking of each area, we use separate different cutoffs for the combined risk scores. So a combined risk score of 0.625 and above, those domestic wells or state small water systems in that area would be considered at risk. Next slide, please. And then domestic wells and state small water systems in areas with a score of 0.25 and above would be considered potentially at risk. And one thing I will call out here, is that there are areas that have the same numeric combined risk score, for example, 0.5, but they have very different indicators contributing to that final score. So an area can have only high water quality risk and have a score of 0.5, or only high drought risk and a score of 0.5. And we do leave those as separate colors in the map because we think it's important to call out where that risk is coming from when you're thinking about solutions for these types of systems. Okay, next slide. So now I'm going to share my screen and give you a demonstration of the online map tool that you can use to explore these results spatially for domestic wells and state small water systems. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen now. And when you first go to the map tool, you have this splash page that gives you a little bit more information where you can find the source data and that same infographic that describes how the combined risk scores are calculated from the different water quality and drought risk scores. So the first thing I'll talk about is the filter that we have on the map. So we do calculate combined risk for the entire state for every square mile section in the state. However, these results are most relevant for areas that have at least one domestic well or one state small water system. And so we do have a filter turned on by default that only shows you those areas. However, you can always turn off the filter if you would like to see all areas of the state, or if you know that there's a domestic well outside of the domestic well record areas. So you can turn that filter off by clicking reset, and you can always turn it back on by clicking apply once again. So I'll zoom in and I'll just show you what kind of information you can get if you click on a square mile section. So there's 4 main components of information. First, it tells you the overall risk of the area. It also tells you how many domestic wells and state small water systems are potentially within that square mile. And then it breaks down the specific risk for water quality, including highlighting any contaminants that may be contributing to that risk. And it also breaks down the specific water shortage risk, and it has the specific scores from the Department of Water Resources tool that tells you there's the overall score and then the 5 different components that contribute to that water shortage risk. And if you zoom in even further, so these dots are the locations of state small water systems, and we don't have point locations for domestic wells. So instead, we show domestic well locations by displaying the count per square mile. So it's effectively showing the density of domestic wells here. If you're only interested in seeing one of the components, so if you only want to see water quality risk or water shortage risk separately instead of combined, we do include those layers over here on the right. So you can see water quality risk only or water shortage risk only. And finally, if you zoom in far enough, you will see the option to display Cal-and-Byre screen results. And if you turn that on, you will see the outline of census tracts. And you can click on them to see information from Cal-and-Byre screen. As a reminder, Cal-and-Byre screen is a tool developed by OWIHA to examine the pollution burden of different areas and also examine how vulnerable communities might be to the effects of pollution. So specifically, you can see Cal-and-Byre screen percentile scores and additionally some demographic information about that census tract. Okay, so now I'll navigate, or I'll stop sharing my screen, or actually, sorry, let me show one more thing about this. If you would like to download this data, there's a couple ways you can do that. You can click over using the 3 dots here. You can either view this data in a table form, and you could export that here, or you can always navigate to show item details, which will take you to our GIS State Water Board portal page, and you can connect directly to the GIS shapefiles and filter or examine that data on your own. Okay, so with that, I will stop sharing my screen and go back to the presentation. Okay, so these 2 slides were just in case the screen share didn't work. So I think we can skip 2 slides ahead. Thank you. So now I'll walk through the numeric statewide results for state small water systems and domestic wells for the 2022 results. We'll start with state small water systems and then continue with domestic wells. So overall, we see about 378 or 30% of state small water systems are in the at-risk category. 438 or 34% are potentially at risk, and 455 or 36% are not at risk. And we do provide the numbers if you were to just use the indicators separately. So if you were only interested in state small water systems water quality risk or only interested in drought risk, we do also provide those numbers here, but I won't read those out. So again, the purpose of this is to identify systems that are the most vulnerable and are the highest priority for solutions. So here we're showing the number of systems that are at risk for water quality issues, 631, the number of systems that are at risk for water shortage, 321, and the number of systems that are at risk for both, which we consider to be the most vulnerable, so that 378. Here we have the state small water systems in the different risk bins broken down by county. So you can see the count of systems at risk, potentially at risk, and not at risk by county. Monterey County has the highest number of at-risk state small water systems. And here we have a socioeconomic analysis of the at-risk state small water systems. So again, we calculated some average socioeconomic statistics, such as the average Cal-and-Byre screen pollution burden percentile, poverty prevalence, and the percentage of systems in majority non-white areas. So we have a statewide baseline, and then we show the different risk bins for state small water systems. I won't read out all of these numbers, but similar to the results from the public water system assessment, we do see that the at-risk state small water systems are also more likely to be in majority non-white areas, and they have a higher CalEnviro screen pollution burden score and have more households in poverty. Here is the specific breakdown of majority race and ethnicity for those at-risk state small water systems. So of the at-risk state small water systems, 48% are in majority white census tracts and 52% are in majority non-white census tracts. Now I'll walk through the results for domestic wells. So according to this year's analysis, about 64,000 or 21% of domestic wells are at risk. About 91,000 or 29% are potentially at risk. And about 157,000 or 50% of domestic wells are not at risk. And we also show the numbers for water quality risk only and for drought risk only. So again, similar to how I explained for state small water systems, this analysis looked at domestic wells that are at risk for water quality and for water shortage, but the most vulnerable wells that are at risk for both are that 64,000 number. And here is the domestic well counts broken down by county. So you see the count of at-risk, potentially at-risk, and not at-risk domestic wells for each county. And Fresno County has the highest number of at-risk domestic wells. And if you would like to look at these, I know I'm sort of going, there's a lot of data on screen here, but all of these graphs are also in the needs assessment report if you want to look at them more closely. And finally, here is the socioeconomic analysis for the at-risk domestic well areas. So we have the same metrics shown on screen. And again, we have a statewide baseline and then the different at-risk domestic wells in the different at-risk areas. And the story is very similar here. Again, the domestic wells that are in at-risk areas, they also have higher CalEnviro screen pollution burden percentiles. They have a higher percentage of households in poverty, and they're much more likely to be in majority non-white areas than not at risk or even potentially at risk domestic wells. So here is the specific breakdown for majority race and ethnicity by census tract, just for the at-risk domestic wells. So 62% of the at-risk wells are in majority white areas, and 38% are in majority non-white areas. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Kristen to talk about proposals for 2023.
Thanks, Emily. Great job providing that overview of the results. So the reason why we incorporated the drought risk this year was, again, based on that feedback that we got after we released the 2021 results. There's definitely a desire to see our risk assessment methodology for state smalls and domestic wells start to move towards the approach that we have for public water systems and mirror the types of indicators and risks that we're looking at there. And so in order to continue that trend, we have been working with the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment and the Department of Water Resources to develop some new socioeconomic risk indicators or metrics to include in our state small and domestic well risk assessment. So we are hoping and plan on conducting a number of workshops this coming year to explore those different metrics that OEHA has been developing with us, and then figure out a methodology for incorporating it into the overall risk assessment. So we're excited to share this information with you later this year. Stay tuned. I hope you're all signed up for our Safer email list so that you can come and participate in those workshops if you're interested. Again, this is the map work that we do for the state smalls and domestic wells is obviously a separate, different approach than what we do for public water systems. We're hoping to collect better data on domestic wells and state smalls moving forward. You can learn a little bit about that in the report, in the retrospective, the county data collection effort that we have underway. We are at the Q&A section of this part of the presentation for state smalls and domestic wells. We have some kind of broad comments in the chat and the Q&A, and I'm hoping folks who are participating on Zoom, you can raise your hand if you have a question. We've got some comments from Diane around concerns around, I think, contamination from grass or synthetic grass. I think, Diane, I think it's important when we're looking at the risk map here for state smalls and domestic wells, the water quality risk is really based off of water quality sample results that come from wells that are at kind of the average depth that you would see a domestic well or state small water system well in an aquifer. And on the drought side, the drought risk work that's done out of DWR, you know, they're looking at a large menu of different risk factors leading to the results of their analysis, everything from precipitation patterns to aquifer levels to, you know, fire risk, etc. They have a whole list of things that they're looking at. And then we take those two results to combine them into this assessment. You know, there's definitely, we recognize a correlation in some instances between water quality and drought, which is why we think it's important to be looking at these together. But we look forward to working with folks over time to improve the data that we have in this assessment and to improve our method for identifying these at-risk systems. I also want to point out that Emily showed you in the map, you can remove that filter that we have to hide those areas of the state where we don't think, or we don't have any record of a state small or domestic well being in that location. You know, you could look at areas that are served by water systems to get a sense of what might be happening there. We do have, throughout the state, we have homes and property that have their own private well, and they're still within the service area of a water system, and same thing for state small water systems. So it's important that you kind of look at the map, understand it, but understand this is a lot of it is modeled risk, and we encourage homeowners, especially to have their wells tested, to take a look at their depth, to really identify whether or not there truly is an issue there, because this is modeled risk. I don't see any hands, and I don't see any additional questions coming in chat. I don't see anything in the email. We've got a quiet bunch today, which is great. It means we have lots of time. We'll wait another minute or so. Okay. Well, Emily, thank you so much for your presentation today and all your hard work on the risk assessment for state smalls and domestic wells. We're going to take a quick 5-minute break for folks, but make sure you come back. We're going to provide an overview of the cost assessment results and the affordability results after this break. So I'm looking at the clock now. I see that it's 10:12. Let's give folks until 10, let's just go to 18. So 10:18, coming back. And thanks again for joining us today. Alrighty, it's 10:18. Again, I really appreciate everyone who is sticking with us. I know this is a long webinar presentation. I'm really excited to bring up onto our panel Moj Kamas, who's with our Needs Analysis Unit. She spearheaded the cost assessment this year. Before Moj comes on and talks about the cost assessment results, I wanted to just provide a brief background on the cost assessment. So typically the cost assessment is supposed to be looking at putting a price tag on interim and long-term solutions for our failing and at-risk water systems. We did a full cost assessment and funding gap analysis last year in the 2021 needs assessment report. And the numbers this year, we did not anticipate changing very much. And instead, we focused our efforts on conducting an alternative cost assessment to really help with the implementation of Senate Bill 552. Moj is going to talk about the requirements in Senate Bill 552, but essentially we did a drought infrastructure cost assessment. We did receive feedback last year when we came out with the full cost assessment, folks asking whether or not you could break out from that cost assessment the just drought related costs. And unfortunately, based on the methodology that we had developed, it was not possible to do that. So we were excited this year to have the opportunity to actually do a targeted drought infrastructure cost assessment. And our goal is going to be to try to incorporate some of the methods and assumptions that you see here today into the full cost assessment that we're able to do hopefully in the next year or two. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Moj. And Moj, I'll be advancing your slides for you, so you let me know when you'd like me to move on.
Thanks, Kristen. Good morning, everyone. My name is Moj Kamas. I'm a water resource control engineer within the Needs Analysis Unit in the Division of Drinking Water. Hopefully today I'll be walking you through the drought infrastructure cost assessment results and just talking about SB 552 requirements and then our cost methodology. So in response to stakeholder feedback and the need to support Senate Bill 552 planning, the State Water Board actually conducted a targeted drought infrastructure cost assessment. And according to that, small water suppliers, those ones are defined to have a service connection range between 15 to less than 3,000, and also K through 12 school to comply with the following requirements with a set deadline assigned to each one of them. So by January 1st, 2023, they need to be able to detect their static well level. And the same deadline applies to being a member in a mutual aid organizations. All small water systems and also K through 12 schools need to have a backup generator in case of a power failure by January 1st, 2024. Also, they need to have a backup source of water supply as a well or inner tie by January 1st, 2027. All service connections need to be metered and monitored for water loss by January 1st, 2032. And for the last requirement here to meet fire flow by January 1st, 2032, unfortunately, it was excluded from our assessment due to the lack of available asset inventory and asset conditions data, also to the lack of any local fire flow requirement. So just to give you a quick comparison between last year's cost assessment and this year's cost assessment, I'll just talk briefly about the systems included, also the long-term solutions or cost estimate activities for both of them. So last year, we focused on failing systems. Those systems are the ones on the human right to water list. We also looked at risk public water systems, state smalls, and domestic wells. For this year, however, we screened all small community water systems. Those ones, again, have a service connection range between 15 to less than 3,000. We also looked at K through 12 schools. Last year, we had a long menu of solutions, long-term cost solutions for systems ranging from technical assistance to physical consolidation, or treatment, or point of use and point of entry. But we also had a whole bunch of systems that required to have essential infrastructure, other essential infrastructure abbreviated as OEI. Those systems could only need like a storage tank or like a new well, backup power, or like upgrading their distribution system or meters, etc. This year's long-term solutions were tailored to meet SB 552 requirements. So those could be monitoring static well levels, backup electrical supply for those like systems who lack it, backup source like a well or energy, and also metering all service connections. And it's really important at this point to highlight that there is an overlap between last year's and this year's cost assessment. As such, in the OEI in last year's cost assessment, there are a lot of systems that might also appear on this year's drought infrastructure, like some systems that needed meters, for example, last year, we also costed out meters for them in this year's drought infrastructure cost assessment. So we cannot add those two numbers, assuming that there's no overlap. Also, last year, we looked at interim cost estimate and 20-year operation and maintenance, but they were both excluded from the 2022 drought cost assessment. So this is just a simple bar chart that would show you the counts of systems that did not meet SB 552 requirements. You'll see here the dark blue bars correspond to the small water system count, and the grayish bars are K through 12 schools. And just quick glance here would show you the highest count of systems not meeting this requirement was attributed to the lack of backup generator, with over 1,556 systems and also 317 schools. And the least requirement for counts of systems were for having an additional source of backup supply, like a well or energy. And we did a lot of analysis in terms of the breakdown of systems based on their safer status. And you can always refer to the needs assessment report and to take a close look on these analyses. It's really worth to mention that all costs in the subsequent slides were adjusted regionally using the RS Mean City Cost Index, abbreviated as CCI. And this means if a system happens to fall in a rural area, there will be no adjustment on the cost, but if it's in an urban, we will increase it by 32%. And if it's in a suburban, the cost will be increased to 30%. And this table just shows the counties that would fall under each category, meaning the counties that would fall under rural and suburban and urban. So for example, let's say if the system happens to be in Sacramento County, that's an urban, then the cost will be increased by 32%. So we also accounted for inflation. I mean, we cannot deny the fact that inflation is driving all the costs for construction and labor way up. So the State Water Board applied a 4.7 inflation multiplier to all costed requirements to conservatively adjust for rising inflation. So the inflation percentage is actually based on the Consumer Price Index, and this is a data that's provided by the U.S. Department of Labor, Bureau of Labor Statistics. Okay, so we talked about some general information, and now I'll take you to dive into the requirement and each requirement, how we identify with the cost assumptions, and then finally how we finalize the cost for each requirement. It's really at this point important to mention that all the cost estimate assumptions came from internal and external feedback, also public feedback. We relied on vendor pricing, and also a lot of equations that have been utilized were previously developed and utilized by our contractor, and they were used in last year's cost assessment report. So I'll start talking about the first one here, production well groundwater levels. So the first step is actually identifying the systems of interest. So we had to utilize systems responses to 2020 year question on if they monitor their well level or not. And this is a non-mandatory question, meaning we will get limited responses to this question. So we had to proactively cost for those systems. So we assume that any system that missed and did not respond to this question is in need, in addition to, of course, any system that responded to no, to having to measure their static well level. So the counts of systems that would fall under this category is 1,213. Thus, this would be for both small community water system and K-12 schools. So now we have the inventory of system, then we need to come up with the cost estimate assumptions. A sounder, it's a device that is used and utilized to measure the groundwater level. And getting this price was a little bit tricky. So after we had a lot of internal discussions, we realized it's not only the unit cost that we need to think about, but also there would be a well modification cost associated. And a well modification cost is very site specific, and it will be very hard to come up with a single cost that would fit all the systems that we have. So we did a lot of reach out and we talked to many vendors, and we found a new technology and a new device that uses sound waves to measure well level. So it's hands-free and we don't have to think about any pollution. The price for this unit is a bit higher than I would say the conventional sounders. So it's $1,700. So we decided to move with the usage of this device instead of like thinking about coming up with well modification costs. So $1,700 is the unit cost for the sounder. So we have the inventory of system and we have the sounder cost. We combine both to finalize the calculation, and then we added on top of that the regional multiplier and also the inflation. And the cost was $2,450,000 for complying with the production, measuring production level. Next slide, please. So second requirement here is mutual aid organization membership. So we contacted CalWARN and it was deemed that there is no cost associated with enrolling in CalWARN. So the cost for this requirement is $0. The third requirement here is continuous operation during power failure. So we had to identify systems that lack a backup generator for their sources. So we had, again, to rely on the 2020 year data. So any system that responded with none to having a backup power was obviously included. But since it's a non-mandatory questions, we got a lot of blank and null responses. So to, again, proactively cost out for systems in need, we decided to include not only none, but blank, null, and some as systems in need. And the counts of systems that would fall under this categories was about 1,872 small systems and K-12 schools. The equations and the cost estimate assumptions that was used to derive the cost was actually dependent on an equation that was developed by our previous contractor, and it was utilized in last year's cost assessment. It depends on calculating the estimated maximum daily demand for the system. And to calculate the maximum daily demand, we have to use 150 gallons per day, and also to think about a peaking factor of 2.25 on the assumptions of 24-hour operation. A fixed generator cost was applied with over 30,000 with a generator multiplier of $341. Based on public feedback that we received after our last webinar, we accounted for a 5% permitting multiplier. So to merge all the assumptions with the inventory that we have, we added the fixed generator cost and multiplied the MDD by the multiplier. And then on top of that, we added the regional multiplier, the 5% permitting cost, and then of course the inflation 4.7, and the cost was almost $245 million. Moving to having a backup source of supply that could be either a well or inertie. Unlike the other requirements, when we relied on EAR data. This time we relied on SIDWIS data. So first we had to identify any system that has a single source, and then we excluded the systems that have an inner tie or surface water. So first we had to do a spatial analysis to look at the feasibility of an inner tie. So if an inner tie isn't feasible, then we would cost out a well for the system if the single source that they already have is a well. So the counts of systems that were feasibly okay to have an inner tie was 142 small community water system and school, and for wells, we costed out for 753 small water system and wells. So in order to determine the cost for the inner tie, we used a lot of assumptions that have been used last year in the consolidation analysis. So to determine the length of the pipeline that would extend from the joining system to the receiving system, we went with the assumption of 1,000 foot. And the cost per foot was $155 with a service line cost of $5,000 and also a connection fee of $6,600. We also accounted for admin and legal costs of $200,000, and 20% was applied for contingency and 25% was applied for planning purposes. So that was all for the inner tie. Now it's time to think about well assumptions. So for well drilling to the 1,000 foot deep, the cost was increased from last time. After receiving a lot of public feedback, we contacted vendors and well drilling companies, and we got a more recent drilling cost. So this one is $1,200,000. And the well production needs to be equal to the maximum daily demand. And I already mentioned how we came up with this number, depending on an average daily demand and a peaking factor. We also accounted for CEQA with 85,000 and SCADA of 100,000. And we had to think also about applying a multiplier of 25% for both planning and construction. So for both well and inner tie, we merged all the cost assumptions along with the systems in need. So we had to finalize the inner tie costs by applying and summing the numbers for the pipeline, the service line, and the connection fees. Also, we included the contingency and the planning. And of course, we have to think about regional multiplier and inflation multiplier. And the inner tie cost was almost 260 million. For the well, however, we added the drilling cost and the development costs, pump and motor, SCADA, CEQA, 25% planning and construction, regional multiplier, and inflation. The cost was way up. It was over 1 billion to have a second well. So this is the last requirement here. It was a more straightforward, which is metering service connections. Same steps as other requirements. First, we need to know what systems are in need. So from EAR, 2020 EAR questions, if the counts of unmetered service connection was greater than 0, so then the system is obviously in need of a meter. So the counts of systems that were in need was deemed to be 1,275. So we have the inventory of systems, and then we have to make the cost assumptions. The equipment cost was increased from last time based on public feedback to 1,200. That is per unmetered connection, and the software is per water system to be 29,000. So then we had to take the 29,000 and then sum it up with the equipment cost per unmetered connection, and then apply regional multiplier and also inflation multiplier to have the final cost of over 245 million. Okay, so this is just a quick look at all the numbers that we discussed earlier, and you'll see here the counts of systems and their percentage based on the total count of small water systems in schools, and also the total cost associated with each one of them. And also finally, you'll see the total of over 2 billion to be able to remediate and bring all systems to meet SB 552 requirement. I really encourage all of you to follow this link to see and take a close look at how we calculated each cost associated with each system. And please, if you see anything that would look not right to you, reach out to us and we will be more than happy to work with you. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think with that being said, I'm done with my part. If you have any questions to me.
Thank you, Moj. That was fantastic. I do want to point out that the cost numbers that we included in the PowerPoint presentation are point estimates. You'll see in the report that we have ranges of costs, which account for what you typically apply when you're doing a engineering cost estimate. So we have a low estimate and a high estimate range. Again, these are all just modeled cost estimates, and the cost numbers will definitely vary at the local level for each water system. Like Moj said, we do have that spreadsheet that clearly summarizes by each water system whether or not we assumed they were meeting the SB 552 requirements or not. Moj did mention that some of the EAR or electronic annual report data that we used for those assumptions were voluntary questions in the EAR. So we had a lot of missing data and needed to make assumptions around what water systems were complying with. So if you go into that spreadsheet and it says that you're not in compliance, but you are, please reach out to us and we're happy to adjust things on our end and make sure that our numbers are updated appropriately. So Moj, I'm monitoring the Q&A box and looking to see if there's any hands raised. I do see a comment. What is the total projected cost needed, including both the drought infrastructure and the needs from last year's assessment? Eric, we mentioned that in the beginning of this presentation from Moj, that there is overlap between what's included in this year's cost assessment and last year's cost assessment. So we do not encourage the addition of last year's numbers with this year's numbers, because you would be double counting infrastructure improvements. So again, please look at those numbers separately, understanding that there's some overlap there. Our intention is, as we move forward with conducting future cost assessments, that we will embed the drought infrastructure cost assumptions that Moj just thoroughly provided an overview of into the full cost assessment, so that you can both pull them out and look at them separately, but also see how they contribute to both the interim and long-term solutions that we cost out for failing and at-risk water systems. So hopefully, Eric, that answers your questions. Happy to follow up outside of this webinar if you have any additional questions around that. All right, I'm not seeing any questions come through, but we can stay on this for just a little bit longer. I don't see any raised hands either. Moj, you did a fantastic job. Lots of work went into that, as you guys can imagine. And I do want to extend a special thanks to our stakeholders who submitted some really fabulous recommendations to us after we released our preliminary thoughts for this year's assessment. You know, we were able to incorporate a lot of feedback into the final numbers that you saw today. Eric has another question. Was the total cost of the SAFER program provided short-term drought solutions, such as emergency well repairs and bottled water, hauled water provisions, to nearly 28,000 individuals? Eric, I don't have that number on me now, but something that we may be able to come up with afterwards. So why don't you reach out to us via email and we can see if we can pull together a number for you. Okay. All righty. I don't see any other questions. But again, if anything comes to you, we are going to have, I think, plenty of time at the end of this webinar for an open Q&A discussion. So if anything pops into your head for both the risk assessment or the cost estimate, please feel free to chime in at the end. I am now going to take over and finish up the presentation. I'm going to give an overview of our affordability assessment results, and then conclude with our next steps. So this is the final component of the needs assessment. It is the affordability assessment. And the purpose of our affordability assessment is to identify disadvantaged community water systems that have instituted customer charges that may exceed affordability threshold. Now, I think it's super important for us to point out that the affordability assessment in the needs assessment is definitely evolving. There are not a whole lot of there's not a whole lot of guidance out there around how the State Water Board should be measuring affordability and what a affordability threshold should be. So I'll talk a little bit about how that has evolved at the State Water Board up until now, and then what our plans are for the future. Before I dig in on all of the data points, I do like to step back and talk about affordability. I think it's a concept, a challenge that can sometimes be difficult to visualize and to grasp. So I like to think about it in 3 different bucket areas that are always influencing each other. When you're looking at affordability, you can look at it through these different lenses. There is household affordability, which is the ability of an individual customer to pay their water bill. You know, can they routinely pay their bill on time? Affordability is really about those individual customers. Customers that are in debt or behind on their bill, there's always the risk of shutoff or having their debt transferred to the county or debt collector, which can really impact that customer in the long run financially. But household affordability then plays into overall community affordability. Does a water systems community have an affordability challenge? Well, that depends on the aggregate, looking at many households or customers across that entire community. You may have in some areas a pocket of residents or customers that are experiencing affordability challenges, but if the whole community as a whole is not, you may not see affordability challenges for that service area. And sometimes that can be an issue if you're wanting to make sure that you're not hurting your lowest income or most affordability or most stretched customers. And last but not least, we have water system financial capacity. So the water system's financial capacity is very much influenced by both community and household affordability. A water system will struggle to raise their rates in the future if their customers can't bear increased rates. And if a water system has current customers that are unable to pay their bills, they may not be bringing in enough revenue to support both their immediate needs and their long-term financial needs, which ultimately will impact the performance of that water system. You might see more water systems fail or be on our at-risk list when they're not able to make the infrastructure upgrades or maintenance needed to maintain their water system. So what are the metrics or data points that we use to try to calculate and identify areas, systems that may have customers experiencing affordability challenges? In 2020, it's not even listed on here, but a few years back, we only used percent median household income. And then last year, when we came out with our first needs assessment report, we used 3 indicators. We used percent median household income, extreme water bill, and percent of shutoffs due to non-payment. Now, we did have a shutoff moratorium during the COVID-19 pandemic. So that meant that when we were collecting data from our electronic annual report last year, that there was no data to collect on this. And so what we needed to do was identify some alternative data sources to be able to really effectively identify communities that are experiencing affordability challenges around this time. I think that's really important to caveat, because the data that we used is arrearage data during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm going to just explain that briefly so that you guys understand what I'm talking about. Arrearage is a fancy word for debt. What we were looking at is water systems who responded to a survey and then an application for a new payment program that was initiated last year to help with outstanding residential and commercial debt that accrued during the COVID pandemic. We use that data to generate 2 new risk indicators for this year. We don't anticipate using the data from the COVID pandemic the March 2020 to January 2022 COVID-19 pandemic data for future integrations of the affordability assessment. This was a one-time use of this particular data set, but we are exploring alternative metrics for the future. But I'm going to provide a brief overview of what these metrics are so you understand how they're embedded in the affordability assessment. I want to highlight too that these indicators are actually also used in the risk assessment too, but we pull them out just for this analysis as well. So percent median household income is looking at the average residential customer charges for 600 cubic feet per month that meet or exceed 1.5% or 2.5% of the median household for within that water system service area. So that's like a lot of words. And so essentially what that means is your customers in a service area for a system, if they're spending about 1.5 or 2.5% of their income on their drinking water bill for the year, then it may be unaffordable. So we use 1.5% as the lower threshold, and then 2.5% as our higher threshold, the max threshold. Extreme water bill is also looking at customer charges. We're looking to see how they compare to what other water systems across the state are charging for the same volume of water. If the water system's bill exceeds 150% or 200% of the statewide average, then we have some additional affordability risk points assigned to that system. The 2 new arrearage or debt burden indicators are last. So the first one is percent of residential arrearages. What we're looking at here is looking at the percent of residential accounts for that water system that had debt during the COVID pandemic. And arrearage is, again, that fancy debt word, which is essentially saying which customer is behind on their bill 60 days past the due date. So it's not that you're late, it's that you're really late. You really have not paid your bill. So percent of residential customers. The second is arrearage burden. So arrearage burden takes a look at the total amount of outstanding residential debt and then says, okay, if you were to spread that out across all of your ratepayers, how much would that burden be to the rest of your ratepayers to overcome that debt? And so it's important that you look at these indicators together, because you could have a water system that has a large percentage of their residential customers in debt, but the debt amount could be very low. It could be like maybe $5 per customer. So when you spread that out across the entire rate base, it's very small burden for that whole rate base. On the other side, you could have an instance where the percent of residential debt is fairly low, but the numbers are really high. It could be $30,000, $40,000, and you spread it across a small rate base. That would be a really large burden for that customer base. So again, really important that we look at these metrics together and not individually. So I think it's important before we start talking about the results to highlight that there is a difference in the inventory or list of water systems that we're looking at in the affordability assessment compared to the risk assessment. Our affordability assessment is looking at all community water systems, regardless of size, and K through 12 schools. The risk assessment is looking only at those small and medium-sized systems. So you can see here the difference between the inventories, if you will. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind when you look at the results, because we do break it out by the risk assessment status for those systems. Again, before we look at the results, I also think it's really important that we start really paying attention to rates data. You'll notice that all 4 of our indicators in the affordability assessment rely on a water system that actually charges their customers for water. Now, customer charges plays a big piece of how systems are performing in the assessment. Percent MHI actually uses the dollar amount in the calculation. Extreme water bill is also utilizing the dollar amount. And then obviously, you know, systems that probably have a lot higher rates probably have, are gonna have maybe higher arrearage burdens as well, because they just in general charge more for water. So looking at rate data is important. The combination of, if you look on the left-hand side of this chart, we do look at DAC and SDAC water systems, and that stands for disadvantaged community and severely disadvantaged community. And that's looking at income levels for the service areas for those systems. So if you have a DAC or SDAC water system, that means that they have really low income for their service area. You can see that those low income water systems on average have a lower rate for 6 HCF for water than non-disadvantaged systems, which may play into some of the results that we see in the affordability assessment. We did break that down in the report to look at how our failing and at-risk systems, how their rates were comparing. And again, you see that same trend where our disadvantaged systems have lower rates than the non-disadvantaged systems for all of those categories, which again might play into the results that we see in the affordability assessment. So what we do is we take a look at to see the number of systems that are meeting the thresholds of concern for each of the individual metrics that we include in the assessment. You can see here in the data that we break it down by DAC and SDAC systems versus non-DAC. And then we also slice and dice the data to look at the SAFER or risk assessment results, failing, at risk, potentially at risk, not at risk. You can see here that a larger percentage of the DAC SDAC systems actually we're seeing a larger percentage of residential arrearages, which we thought was interesting, but not a whole lot of trend data here in the analysis. The second thing we did was, you know, again, because I mentioned this earlier, I think it's really important that we look at performance across all of the affordability indicators together, because it'll tell a clear picture of whether or not that community may be experiencing affordability challenges. You can see here there's a dramatic decline in the number of systems exceeding multiple thresholds. So the vast majority of our water systems analyzed did not exceed any of the affordability thresholds. But as we go down, you know, 1, 2, 3, or 4 thresholds, you get fewer and fewer systems. So 3+, so 3 or 4, we have a much smaller list of systems exceeding those thresholds. And the most of them are DAC, SDAC communities. To make things hopefully a little bit easier to follow in the report, we kind of bin them into high, medium, low affordability burden bins. We looked at the human right to water and at-risk systems and how they were performing in those bins. Again, not a whole lot of strong trend data here. And we even broke it up by the failing DAC and SDAC systems as well. Again, there's a lot of analysis in the report if you're interested in digging in on that. Similar to what we did for the risk assessment, we did compare the results of the affordability assessment to the socioeconomic metrics that we pulled out of OEHA and out of the US Census. You can see here, it's the same trends that we've seen across the rest of the needs assessment report, and that when you look at the statewide average, if you go from no affordability burden to high affordability burden, you start to see trends upwards, at least in our pollution burden and poverty prevalence. And we see a little bit of back and forth on non-white customers served. Again, we do have more metrics or indicators in the report if you're interested in diving into those results. The underlying data in the affordability assessment is available on our website in a spreadsheet if you'd like to dig in there. It's also in the affordability category of the dashboard that I demoed earlier. So if you're interested to see which systems are performing at high, medium, low affordability risk, you can definitely check that out. But again, if there's anything that doesn't look right in a water systems data set, please contact us. We're happy to recalculate the results of the affordability assessment and the risk assessment for those systems. Oops, wrong direction. But again, I think it's really important for us to talk about the future of the affordability assessment. One of the things that I think is really important to highlight is the fact that all 4 of our current indicators are reliant on water systems that charge their customers directly for water. And essentially what that does is it excludes a couple hundred water systems, especially small ones, from the affordability assessment, because we do have a lot of water systems like mobile home parks that do not charge their customers directly for water. Usually water costs are embedded in their tenants' rent or other charges and would not be captured in any rate data. So our goal has been over the past year, we've been working with OEHA and others to identify alternative data sets that can help us identify communities that may be experiencing affordability challenges without relying on rate-related data. So our goal is to start hosting a series of workshops this year to solicit public feedback and recommendations and ideas on how we can further refine and improve our affordability assessment, both for public water systems, but also for inclusion in the state small and domestic well risk assessment as well. So we really encourage you all to participate in that. We are looking at poverty prevalence and housing cost burden. These are 2 metrics that were called out in our 2020 workshops where we identified potential affordability metrics. These really rose to the top for a lot of folks. So we did start here, but that doesn't mean that this is the only 2 that we're looking at. So again, we look forward to working with stakeholders on developing new affordability metrics and thresholds. I'm going to just go through some conclusions and then we'll have an open Q&A. So if you have any questions or comments about the affordability assessment, that will be the time to bring them up. You can always use the Q&A box now to start adding your questions in. So I like to highlight, and you probably noticed based off all of the changes that we talked about today, but the needs assessment is something that continues to change and grow over time. It's not meant to be a static methodology. Our goal is to learn and improve. We're constantly trying to improve our data sets, improve how we collect data and how we analyze it, to inspect and better understand why systems are failing and what's keeping them on the failing list, so that we have a better method for identifying at-risk water systems and domestic well and state small communities. We really rely on stakeholder feedback from you guys and recommendations on how to improve our work over time. We still think 77% is a fairly good predictive power, but we want to see that go up too. So we want to make sure that we're really capturing those systems before they fail, so we can be more proactive in providing solutions to those communities. Some refinement opportunities that we're very much aware of, that we're always welcome to have you suggest some new things added to this list. Like I said, we want to improve our data. We want to have better alignment across our needs assessment components, making sure that they're fully integrated as much as possible. We want to make sure that we have a really focused scope for the work that we're doing. We're always trying to align our efforts with what's happening across the state. You can see that we partner strongly with OEHA and the Department of Water Resources, and connecting with our partners over at CPUC as well. The refinement of the affordability assessment is a top priority for us this year. We're definitely looking forward to your participation in those workshops. And we want to continue to learn by doing, and to continue getting suggestions from the public through all of our public engagement work underway through our engagement units and through our Office of Public Participation. As many of you know, if you're subscribed to our Safer email list, we're constantly sending out emails about workshops and events that we're hosting underneath the Safer program. We do have a calendar of events on our Safer website. You can see we still have a number of TBD dates here, but please stay tuned, subscribe to our email list so that you can participate in future events if you're interested. This calendar does not include the affordability workshops I mentioned. I'm hoping to get those added to the calendar soon. We need to do a little bit of planning on our side before we can release those dates, but this is going to be growing. But for immediate next steps, I really encourage you all to start playing around with that dashboard, to download those spreadsheets that we link to look at the underlying data, and let us know if we've made a mistake. Let us know if our data is inaccurate for an individual water system or maybe a handful of systems. We're happy to make some data changes in our work and update the results online. So we encourage everyone to use the forms link here to submit those data change requests. If you haven't already, please check out our report. I shared a link with most of the registrants yesterday afternoon, but if you only registered today or last night, there is a link to our website here. Please check out our website where you'll find the report. We have a 2-pager. You'll find a copy of today's presentation, and the webinar recording will be posted there as well. We're always looking for feedback. We have a feedback deadline on the 2022 results of June 6, 2022. So please email us at safer@waterboards.ca.gov. We are happy to hear what your thoughts are, and definitely want to consider your recommendations for future iterations of the needs assessment. We have one last poll, which I'm going to launch now. And I'm going to expand this to include the dashboard. Would you be interested in a training session on how to navigate the spreadsheets that we've mentioned today and the dashboard that I briefly demoed earlier? Just wanted to know if we should be scheduling another workshop in the near future on this. So appreciate your participation in the survey. Alrighty, I'm going to end the poll in just 5 seconds. Oops, there we go. It looks like we've got a majority yeses and maybes. So we're very likely to host another workshop or webinar just to go over the underlying data in the needs assessment and provide an overview and demo of the new dashboard that we launched yesterday. So I appreciate everyone's participation in that poll. And we're opening it up. So if you have questions, comments, please use the Q&A or raise your hand. Again, if you are participating via the Cal EPA live webcast, you can email us at safer@waterboards.ca.gov. We do have staff monitoring that inbox and will share your question with us. All right, we have a question. What type of state funding is available for utilities to comply with SB 552? We do have folks from our Division of Financial Assistance on the line. Is Jasmine or Megan available to answer this question?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Moises, for your question. So at the moment, we don't have any funding specific to SB 552. However, some of our funding sources already existing could potentially assist with some of those items. And so we would encourage water systems to apply. There were also SB 552 requirements for counties, and we do have a county-wide and regional funding program that we're developing at the moment. The solicitation is out currently. You know, there may be additional funding with this coming budget, but we'll have to wait and see if there's anything more specific to SB 552. Thanks.
Thank you, Jasmine. As a follow-up, we do have another question that asks, what is the best way to contact the State Water Board to request assistance for systems on the failing list and the at-risk list? I would say just shooting us an email at safer@waterboards.ca.gov is a good way to start. But Jasmine or others, do you have any other recommendations on how to get a hold of us?
I would agree. Our funding websites provide more information about, specific types of projects and eligibility. So please reach out.
I don't see any other questions, but I'm definitely happy to stay on the line in case folks are still thinking of things. James asks whether or not SB 552 funding will come from the SAFER funding, the $130 million per year. Jasmine?
Hi again. So potentially, however, we are in the process of developing our fiscal year 2022-23 fund expenditure plan for the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund. So we would be using the results of this new needs assessment to kind of inform, what we establish as our funding priorities for the coming fiscal year, and we'll need to propose those to our board. But the timeline for that would be, we're hoping to release a draft of that plan in August with a workshop following, and then proposed to our board for consideration in early November. So please, keep your eyes out for announcements on that, and please do engage with us during that process.
Thank you, Jasmine. We do have another question in that's asking whether or not we know how much funding from the Ggrf will be allocated to SAFER this year.
I don't believe we have heard or confirmed, but we'll be proposing our coming fiscal year's fund expenditure plan, assuming that we do receive the full $130 million.
All right, give folks another few minutes. I do have a comment in from our SAFER team. We do have a map on our website that has our engagement unit staff who are assigned to different areas within the state. So if you're interested in getting in touch with our engagement units, please feel free to take a look at that map on our SAFER website to identify the appropriate contact person. But again, you can just email us at safer@waterboards.ca.gov and we can put you in touch with the right person. I do see a hand raised. I think, is that you, Eric? I'm going to allow you to talk.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. Thanks, Kristen. So hi, everyone. My name is Eric Oriana, and I'm a policy advocate with Community Water Center. I wanted to first start off by saying thank you to staff for all their work on this report. This really is super important to addressing the human right to water, as you all shared as part of the presentation. So it was a task to review this report, so I can only imagine how hard it was to put this together. So I just want to say thank you for that. And I also wanted to share some sort of thoughts and comments in response to what we're seeing as part of this report. And I just wanted to sort of emphasize the folks in the water systems that we're talking about are real communities in our state. And so it's important to really ground us in that folks in our communities are being exposed to unsafe drinking water and that they're on the front line of these pollutions. And so I just wanted to note that more than 500 at-risk water systems and close to 500 potentially at-risk water systems are being found here in the 5th largest economy in the world. I just wanted to also say that this is a real stain on this great state's reputation, and the disproportionate number of at-risk or failing systems serving non-white Californians is a remnant of the systemic racism woven into the fabric of our society. I also wanted to note that more than 1 in 5 MCL violations are nitrate related. And I also saw that nitrate is the highest single water quality threat to state small water systems and private domestic wells. And so just given sort of that key sort of piece of information, I wanted to share that things like nitrates, things like arsenic are caused by entities out there. Arsenic is naturally occurring, but it's exacerbated by lowering groundwater levels and nitrate as well. But nitrate is particularly caused by the agricultural industry in the state of California. And so I wanted to highlight a report from Levi and others from 2021 from the United States Geological Survey, which found a direct linkage between aquifer pumpage and groundwater quality on a regional scale, and that the relationships between overdraft and water quality in the Central Valley are driven by intensive irrigation and pumpage. And so I just wanted to note that this program is meant to address the myriad challenges that our communities are already facing, but there are responsible parties out there. And given the limited number of funds that the SAFER program has, it's really, really important that we go after those folks who are causing these problems in our communities and who are taking advantage of our communities, quite frankly. And so I just wanted to continue to see sort of more work being done to ensure folks like the CV Salts program and the management zones are being held responsible, and that we're tapping their funds before we tap the funds of the SAFER program, or if we're using SAFER program funds, that we recuperate those costs because there are liable parties. And additionally, I just wanted to share that it's a real shame that 21% of Californians are served by failing at-risk or potentially at-risk systems, and more than half of at-risk systems, at-risk state small water systems, are communities of color. And so really wanted to appreciate the work in this year's needs assessment to quantify sort of racial disparities. I know there's a lot of challenges with data out there, but I just wanted to encourage staff to continue to do this type of work because this work is really necessary for us to highlight sort of the racial disparities. I wanted to share a journal that I found. I'm happy to share these citations and articles with you all through email. One titled Inequities in Drinking Water Quality Among Domestic Well Communities and Community Water Systems in California by Pace, Balaz, and others, found that communities of color statewide are disproportionately affected by arsenic, nitrate, and chromium-6 contamination of drinking water, both in community water systems and domestic well areas, with findings most pronounced in domestic well areas. And so I just wanted to share all this to say that both racial inequity and both industry that's not being regulated correctly are leading to the challenges that we're seeing today. And we need to keep these in mind when we're trying to address these solutions. And so I appreciate you all allowing me to comment. Hope to continue to work with you all, and happy to follow up with you all as well through email, and appreciate you all answering all my questions.
Thank you so much, Eric. And we definitely appreciate your participation today and in our previous workshops. Again, feedback is really important to us as we continue to improve our work here on the needs assessment. All right, trying to see, I don't see any other questions in our Q&A box, and I don't believe I see any other hands raised. And nothing in our inbox either, which is great. We might have a shorter webinar session today. You guys can all get another almost 45 minutes back on your calendar. Alrighty, well, I'm gonna stay on for an extra 30 seconds, give you all an opportunity to type a question in or comment. But if not, I wanna give a big thank you to all of our panelists today, all of the folks who are on the needs analysis unit team who've worked so hard over this past year to help make this 2022 needs assessment a reality. Beyond that, we have partners throughout the entire water board and our partner agencies who've also helped contribute to the report and all of the findings. I can't thank enough our IT departments and OEMA for helping us with making the dashboard a reality in such a very short period of time. I can't stress how much work went into putting that together. And I hope you all find it useful. Please let us know if you have any suggestions on how to improve the dashboard. It is our version 1.0. We do anticipate making a number of enhancements to that based on public feedback. Again, I want to thank all of you for joining us today on this Thursday morning. We really appreciate your continued engagement with the SAFER program and on the continued refinement of the needs assessment. Stay tuned for all of those workshops I mentioned that are coming soon if you want to get more involved. And if you know anybody who's super into data and wants to get into the weeds with us, please make sure you share our information with them. We're always looking to nerd out with some other folks on water data. So with that, I'm going to end the webinar, and this webinar recording should be posted soon, hopefully, and we'll send out an email notification when it is. So again, everyone, take care, and thanks again for joining.